The room went still. No glass clinking, no idle chatter, just that frozen, airless silence that happens when someone says something they can't take back. The billionaire, crisp suit, voice like cold steel, leaned just a little too close to the young waitress and said, "You stir slower than I thought, stupid, really." He didn't whisper it. He didn't care who heard. What he didn't notice was who else was sitting at the table. A deal, worth $3.5 billion, was about to be signed in that very restaurant. Contracts in leather folders, pens laid neatly beside them, a handshake away from history. And in that moment, one man's arrogance, one single insult, shifted the balance entirely. Here sits what most people miss about power. It isn't lost all at once. It slips away in small, careless moments. Moments like this. She didn't know it yet, but the woman he'd just humiliated, the one standing there with coffee still trembling in her hand, was about to become the reason that deal never closed. And the man who thought he owned the room? He was about to learn that there are forces in business more dangerous than a competitor. Forces like moral consequence. But to understand why this single moment collapsed a multi-billion-dollar empire, you have to see where each of them came from. And for that, we need to go back. Her name was Naomi Carter. 29 years old, 6 months into working double shifts at a high-end downtown restaurant. Not because she loved the job, but because it was the only place that would hire her without running a background check. 2 years earlier, Naomi had been working as a junior analyst for a financial firm, bright, precise, the kind of person who caught errors no one else saw. She thought she was building a career. Then came the audit, the one where her department took the fall for a senior executive's fraud. She refused to lie in the hearing. The price? Her job, her reputation, and the quiet, invisible stamp on her name that made corporate doors slam shut before she could even knock. Restaurants, however, didn't care much about scandal in the financial sector, as long as you could carry plates and smile under pressure. Still, Naomi noticed things. Who spoke first at each table? Who avoided eye contact? Which guests tipped in cash to avoid a paper trail? She didn't just serve, she read the room. That night, she'd been assigned to the private corner table, the kind reserved for the city's most powerful visitors. A merger meeting, 2 corporate boards. And at the center, Maxwell Royce, a man Forbes had crowned the architect of modern retail dominance. Maxwell didn't see Naomi, he saw a uniform. In his mind, people like her existed in the background, interchangeable, disposable. But seated across from him was Richard Leving, an old-school industrialist who valued loyalty over leverage. Richard was the buyer in the $3.5 billion deal, and unlike Maxwell, Richard watched people when they thought no one was looking. When Maxwell insulted Naomi, Richard's eyes flicked toward her, just long enough for her to register the recognition. That was the moment the air shifted. Not because Richard was sentimental, but because he knew something Maxwell didn't set. How a leader treats the powerless is how they'll treat their partners when power shifts. Here sits what that moment teaches us. People are always running 2 audits on you, one on your numbers, and one on your character. The first earns their money. The second earns their trust. The insult was the spark, but the real fuel. A system that had allowed men like Maxwell to move unchecked, unchallenged, and untouched for decades, because everyone assumed their money excused their behavior. That night, someone decided not to excuse it anymore. And Naomi, she was about to be pulled into a moral crossroads she never asked for, and one she couldn't ignore. Naomi could have walked away. That was the safer move. Drop off the coffee, ignore the sting in her chest, and retreat to the kitchen, where the air was thick with steam and chatter instead of arrogance. But something stopped her. It wasn't pride. Pride was a luxury she'd learned to store away after her fall from the corporate ladder. It was that same instinct that had once made her a strong analyst. The ability to spot patterns, to notice when something in the room didn't add up. She glanced at Richard Leving, the buyer. His jaw was tight, his fingers tapping once against the table. He hadn't touched the pen beside the contract. In that split second, Naomi realized she was standing inside a live negotiation, not just for a deal but for respect, and she was now part of the equation. The fork in the road was clear. Stay silent. Let the insult die in the air, pretend it didn't happen, and fade back into the background. The role society had written for her since the scandal. Push back, subtly, intelligently. Not to humiliate Maxwell but to remind him, and everyone watching, that dignity is not optional. Here sits where most people get it wrong. Speaking up doesn't always mean raising your voice. Sometimes it means changing the frame of the conversation, so power shifts without anyone realizing until it's too late. Naomi didn't yet know which path she would take, but something in Richard's eyes told her that the next thing she said, or didn't say, would carry more weight than she could imagine. The waitress apron suddenly felt heavier, not because of the fabric, but because of the choice it now symbolized. A single action could flip the entire outcome, for her, for Maxwell, for the deal itself. And then, Maxwell made it worse. Leaning back, smirking just enough for his words to drip arrogance, he said, "You know I like my staff like I like my machines, fast, efficient, and silent." The choice was no longer theoretical. It was now. And Naomi was about to decide whether to play the game, or change it entirely. Naomi took a slow breath. Her training wasn't in service, it was in systems. Before life shoved her into this apron, she'd spent years studying market behavior, corporate strategy, and risk analysis. And right now she was reading Maxwell like a balance sheet bleeding red ink. His arrogance wasn't confidence, it was over-leverage. Men like him hid behind the size of their empire, assuming no one in the room could touch them. But she knew better. The bigger the empire, the more fragile the ego. Naomi stepped closer, just enough to refill his coffee without spilling a drop. Her voice was calm, almost deferential. "Of course, sir, though in my experience the most valuable machines are the ones you can replace." It was subtle, a statement that could be taken as service banter, but also as a quiet checkmate to anyone listening closely. Richard's eyes narrowed, not in anger, in interest. Here sits what Maxwell missed. Naomi wasn't speaking to him. She was speaking to the table. The lawyers, the junior executives, the assistant who would carry this story back to the office. In every negotiation, there's the official conversation and the shadow conversation that decides the real outcome. Naomi had just planted a seed in that shadow conversation, a reminder that people are assets, not accessories. She didn't know it yet, but one of the men at the far end of the table recognized her name from the finance scandal 2 years earlier. He knew the truth of what had happened, and how she'd chosen integrity over self-preservation. The room shifted again, just slightly, but enough. For the first time Maxwell looked unsettled, not because Naomi had spoken, but because others had noticed her speak. This was the first small reversal of power. It was quiet, almost invisible. But the most dangerous shifts always are. And yet, power doesn't change hands without resistance. Naomi was about to discover just how far the system would go to push her back into silence. It happened before the plates were even cleared. Maxwell didn't address Naomi again, he didn't have to. The shift manager appeared at her side, smiling too wide, voice pitched just high enough to sound like concern, but carry a warning. "Naomi, I think you should let Marcus take over this table. Translation, you've been noticed, and not in the way we approve of." Naomi stepped back, handing over the coffee pot without protest. On the surface it looked like compliance. Inside she was replaying the chain of events. Maxwell had power over the deal, the restaurant had power over her paycheck, and both had the ability to erase her from the scene. In the kitchen, the noise was louder, the air thicker, but Naomi could still feel the echo of the silence she'd left behind. It was the kind of silence that said she'd stepped over an invisible line. Here sits the truth about systems of power. They don't need to punish you publicly, they just remove you from the room where decisions happen. That way no one can say you were silenced, only that you were set part of the conversation. 10 minutes later, while Naomi polished glasses near the bar, she overheard fragments from the corner table. Richard Sepp's tone was cooler now, measured. Maxwell, on the other hand, had turned up the charm, leaning hard into the language of efficiency, profitability, and streamlined partnerships. The deal was still alive, for now. But Naomi wasn't spent, not in their eyes. She was back to being invisible. And that invisibility burned more than Maxwell's insult, because she knew how dangerous it was. When you can be seen, you can influence. The breaking point came when she was called into the manager's office after the shift. The words were polite, the message was not. "We think it's best you take a week off. This is a high-profile season for us, and well, we need to keep things smooth." A week without tips meant rent would be tight. A week out of sight meant she'd miss the conclusion of the very event she'd just stepped into. She walked home that night with the weight of it pressing against her ribs. The city lights blurred as she thought about the path she'd chosen, that small calculated pushback. Had she made a mistake? By the time she reached her apartment door, Naomi had convinced herself of one thing: she had been cut out of the story. What she didn't know was that someone else had just written her back in. The call came 2 days into her forced week off. Naomi didn't recognize the number, but the voice on the other end was calm, deliberate, the kind of voice used to making decisions worth millions without raising its volume. "Miss Carter, this is Richard living." For a moment she thought it was a prank. Billionaires didn't call waitresses at home, but then he continued. "I was at your table the other night. I know who you are, and I know what happened to you 2 years ago wasn't your fault. Naomi's grip on the phone tightened. She hadn't heard those words, "wasn't your fault," from anyone in authority since the day she lost her career. Richard explained that after the dinner, he'd quietly pulled her name from the restaurant roster. A contact of his had confirmed her story. The whistleblowing, the fallout, the blacklisting. And then he said something that shifted everything. "You have an instinct for reading leverage, Miss Carter, and leverage is what closes billion-dollar deals." He wasn't stud offering her a job, not yet. What he offered was an invitation. The next board meeting with Maxwell's company would be held in 3 days, in the same city. Richard wanted her there, not as a waitress, not as a guest, as an observer in his team's strategy session. Naomi hesitated. This wasn't just a second chance, it was a direct line into the room where the $3.5 billion decision would be made, but it also meant stepping back into the same arena that had destroyed her once before. Richard seemed to hear the hesitation in her silence. "The thing about systems," he said, "is they only look unbeatable until someone uses them against themselves." That was the spark. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Sometimes the turning point isn't when you fight harder, it's when you realize you don't have to fight by their rules at all. Naomi agreed, quietly, without fanfare. Because if there was one thing she learned in both finance and food service, it was this. The people who underestimate you will never see you coming. Over the next 3 days, she studied everything Richard's team sent her: shareholder patterns, public statements, internal memos leaked to the press. Every chart, every note, every flaw in Maxwell's empire. By the time the boardroom doors would open, Naomi would not be walking in as a bystander. She could be walking in with a plan. The day of the board meeting, Naomi didn't dress to stand out. A simple navy suit, no jewelry except a watch she'd bought back when she still had an analyst's salary. She wasn't there to announce her presence, she was there to position it. Richard's team welcomed her in without introduction to the larger group. She took a seat against the wall, the unremarkable observer in a room of heavy hitters. Maxwell entered like a man expecting to win. His tailored suit seemed to command space. His handshake with Richard was staged for the cameras. He scanned the room, eyes sliding over Naomi without recognition, just another nameless assistant in his mental ledger. That was the first advantage. Naomi had spent the past 3 days mapping the pressure points in Maxwell's company. The supply chain bottlenecks, hidden behind PR gloss. The underpaid regional managers threatening to unionize. The unfiled environmental compliance reports that could, with the right nudge, become public within days. She didn't bring these up directly, instead she fed small, precisely chosen observations to Richard's chief negotiator during breaks. Notice how his CFO avoided committing to a delivery timeline. That new overseas facility, it's not operational yet, despite what the last shareholder letter said. Each note was like a chess piece, sliding into place. Here sits the thing about power plays. The most effective ones are invisible until the very last move. Naomi wasn't fighting Maxwell head-on, she was letting him talk himself into a corner, tightening the noose with his own overconfidence. By midday, Richard's team had shifted their strategy entirely. Instead of chasing Maxwell's terms, they began quietly testing his weak spots, asking for guarantees he couldn't provide without revealing the cracks in his empire. Naomi stayed silent through it all, jotting down details, offering quiet input only when asked. No spotlight, no applause, just the slow, steady tightening of the net. And then as the final session began, Naomi slipped a single folded note to Richard himself. 6 words, no more. Richard read it, looked across the table at Maxwell, and smiled. The trap was ready. All that remained was to spring it, publicly, in front of every decision-maker in the room. The final round of talks began like every other. Formalities, scripted pleasantries, the quiet clicking of pens. Maxwell sat forward, voice smooth, projecting certainty. He recited figures as though they were already history. His board nodded in rhythm, each one convinced they were minutes away from sealing the $3.5 billion merger. Then Richard leaned back, casual, almost conversational. Before we sign, Maxwell, there's just one condition I need to clarify. That overseas facility you touted in your last shareholder letter, the one in Shenzhen, is it operational as of today? A flicker, quick but there, crossed Maxwell's face. Of course it is. We've been in full production for weeks. Richard Sepp's smile didn't change. Interesting, because my team received a customs report this morning. The facility hasn't cleared a single shipment, not one. Care to explain? The room went still. Even Maxwell's own CFO stopped scribbling notes. Here sits the thing about lies and high-stakes negotiations. They don't just weaken your position, they invite every other doubt to surface. One by one, Richard's team laid out the vulnerabilities Naomi had uncovered, the unfiled compliance reports, the pending labor disputes, the bottleneck in the supply chain that Maxwell had glossed over. And then Richard delivered the line that ended it. If you sit not transparent with me, Maxwell, why should I believe you sit be transparent with your partners? Maxwell tried to recover, to bluff his way back into control, but the damage was visible now, in the shifting eyes of his own directors, in the whispered exchanges at the far end of the table. The note Naomi had given Richard earlier had been simple. He lies when he thinks no one sits looking. Richard had used that truth as a blade, slicing through Maxwell's credibility in front of everyone. The deal collapsed within the hour. No shouting, no dramatic walkouts, just the slow, silent withdrawal of pens from contracts, the quiet stacking of untouched folders. Maxwell left the room without shaking Richard's hand. For a man who had built an empire on dominance, the silence that followed him out was the loudest defeat he had ever faced. And Naomi? She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The victory wasn't in the humiliation, it was in the proof that arrogance could be dismantled with nothing more than observation, timing, and the right 6 words. By morning, the business press had its headline. $3.5 billion merger collapses after credibility concerns. The articles didn't mention Naomi by name, they didn't need to. In the corridors of influence, people already knew. Whispers traveled faster than press releases. Maxwell's stock dropped 12% in 2 days. Investors began calling emergency meetings. His board, suddenly aware of the liabilities he had been hiding, started weighing their options and their loyalties. It wasn't long before rumors surfaced of a leadership transition. In other words, a quiet removal. Richard, meanwhile, moved forward with a different partner, one whose operations were clean, whose numbers matched their promises. The message was clear. The deal hadn't failed because of market shifts. It had failed because trust was broken at the table. And Naomi? She received an unmarked envelope at her apartment 1 week later. Inside was a handwritten note from Richard. Integrity is the rarest currency. You didn't just protect me from a bad deal, you reminded me why character matters in business. If you sit willing, I sit like to put that currency to work. Enclosed was an offer letter, a position as a corporate intelligence consultant within Richard's firm, the same work she had once dreamed of doing before the scandal. Naomi accepted, not because she needed revenge, that was never the goal, but because she had earned something far more enduring, a place where her voice carried weight. Here stints what that moment teaches us. Justice doesn't always come in headlines. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet correction of a story, where the person written off as powerless ends up shaping the ending. Maxwell's empire survived, but smaller, chastened, and without the unchecked arrogance that had once defined it. And for those who had witnessed the negotiation that day, a lesson lingered. How you treat the least powerful person in the room will determine how the most powerful see you. In the years that followed, Naomi's role in that fateful negotiation became something of a quiet legend in certain business circles. Not because it was flashy, but because it was surgical. No shouting, no public crusade, just precision, timing, and an unshakable sense of dignity. Richard often described her as the person who saved me from the deal that would have sunk us. But Naomi saw it differently. I didn't save you, she told him once. I just reminded the room what integrity looks like. She never forgot the feeling of that restaurant night, the sting of being dismissed, the weight of the choice she faced. And she carried that memory into every meeting, every analysis, every quiet piece of intelligence she uncovered for Richard's firm. Her story became a kind of compass for the younger analysts she mentored. When you see arrogance hiding behind power, remember, arrogance is always a liability waiting to be exposed. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Systems don't change because we shout at them. They change when enough people inside and outside the system decide that certain behavior is no longer profitable. And the most powerful leverage you will ever have is your reputation for telling the truth, even when it costs you. So the next time you find yourself underestimated, remember Naomi Carter. You don't have to raise your voice to shift the balance. You just have to know where the pressure points are, and have the courage to touch them. If this story resonated with your values, I'd like to leave you with this. Ask yourself today, who is watching how I treat the people I think can affect me? Because someone always is. Like, comment, and subscribe if you believe integrity should still have a place in the world, and share this story with someone who's been told they don't matter. They might just be one decision away from proving everyone wrong.